Teenagers are smoking.
Could you wear a nicotine patch to help you stop vaping?
Every cigarette you smoke can shave about 20 minutes off your life.
There's no evidence, by the way, that nicotine is a carcinogen. It's not. It's all a lie. And what they hate about nicotine is it raises testosterone levels.
Warning! This product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical, which is a good thing for us.
Nicotine is healthy? What? No, you didn't get clickbaited, I promise. Is nicotine really the misunderstood bad guy, or could there be a case for using it differently? Let's break down what the science really says about nicotine and products like cigarettes and snus, which has become very popular. Spoiler alert, it's complicated. After watching this video about nicotine, you will have a great idea about how nicotine works in human physiology, how are nicotine products different with each other, and most importantly, the answer to the question, is nicotine ever healthy to consume? Before we dive in, let's clear the air. Nicotine is a highly addictive compound. It interacts with our brain and body in fascinating but yet dangerous ways. This video is not a justification for the use of nicotine, but rather an exploration of what the science really shows about nicotine, its health effects, and potential benefits it could have as a substance. And also, just because nicotine as a substance could have some health benefits in very small doses, this doesn't mean that when you smoke a cigarette and you get 20 or even 30 times this dose, along with another 3,000 toxins, it's the same exact thing. It's not. I think it also could be of great importance before we dive into the science to talk a little bit about the history of nicotine. Understanding where we come from gives us powerful context about where we are now. Nicotine's story is deeply connected with tobacco, which has been used for centuries now. In the early days, smoking and chewing tobacco were primarily activities used by the working class and rural communities. Tobacco was cheap and accessible, making it a staple for the poor, while the upper class viewed it as vulgar. But everything changed in the 20th century. Smoking began to shift from being a habit of the poor to being a symbol of sophistication. But how? Enter advertising and clever entrepreneurship. Tobacco companies realized the power of public figures. You might have seen this lady. Suddenly, smoking was no longer a habit, it was a lifestyle. What's particularly fascinating to me is how smoking became a symbol of women's liberation in the 1920s and 1930s. At the time, women were fighting for equal rights and feminism, and smoking was a way to mirror men's independence. Soon, it became a statement. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, and the image of smoking continued to evolve. As advertising skyrocketed, cigarettes became a symbol of wealth and even health, promoted by countless doctors as medicine. In my opinion, this is also a very important note that we should question science. If we hadn't, then we would smoke cigarettes for health even today. Tobacco companies heavily leaned into psychological manipulation, associating cigarettes with everything from relaxation to sophistication. But here is the irony. By the time this cultural shift was becoming solidified, the health effects of cigarettes and tobacco products were becoming apparent. Early studies began to link cigarettes to health conditions, neurological conditions, lung damage, and by the late 20th century, cigarettes were becoming stigmatized. As fascinating this history can be, and as powerful the context it gives us, we should now refer to the actual science about nicotine. So when we talk about nicotine today, or any day that you watch this video, we're not talking about just a simple chemical compound. It's about the cultural weight and the complex history it carries. But nicotine is not just an addictive compound. It's a biochemical multitasker that affects hormones, neurotransmitters, metabolism, and your entire health. To fully understand nicotine's effects, we first need to see how it interacts with our brain and body. 1. How does nicotine cross the blood-brain barrier, meaning going through your blood vessels to your brain? Nicotine is a small lipophilic molecule, which means it can easily pass through membranes. Within seconds of inhaling or absorbing nicotine, it very quickly passes the blood-brain barrier and binds to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in your brain. These receptors, especially the A4B2 subtype, are concentrated in areas like the nucleus basalis, a region involved in attention, learning, and memory. When nicotine binds to these nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, it enhances some cognitive functions like learning and memory, which is where some potential benefits of nicotine come from. So if you've heard your friend smoke a cigarette or take a snus tell you that he feels more concentrated and focused afterwards, he probably isn't lying. In general, in neuroscience, we tend to see higher acetylcholine concentrations in the areas of the brain being used at that specific time for a specific task. But let's talk about the reward pathway. You've probably heard of dopamine by now if you've opened Instagram or TikTok in the last couple months. Dopamine does that, dopamine does this, dopamine detox, dopamine. You hear it all the time. But what is the effect of nicotine on dopamine? Nicotine also hijacks your brain's reward pathway called the mesolimbic system. This pathway also includes the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. These areas are responsible for feelings of pleasure. Here's how it works. Nicotine stimulates the release of dopamine in this area, creating that feel-good sensation and potentially feeling of reinforcement, which dopamine tends to do. But this also reinforces the behavior, making you want to use nicotine again. Additionally, nicotine increases adrenaline and norepinephrine levels, making you feel both energized and focused. This is a very unique combination because usually what makes us feel alert does not also make us feel relaxed, and the other way around. But yet nicotine somehow is able to both make us feel alert and energized and relaxed. I find this to be extremely interesting. Something also very interesting is the effect of nicotine on appetite suppression. By now, let me also highlight that this video is very short. If you want to truly understand the effects of nicotine in the human physiology, then I highly suggest you watch this podcast from Huberman. This video is about something else, but we need some context about how nicotine works in order to then dive into potential health benefits and do a conclusion about what truly is nicotine. Let's go back to appetite suppression. How does nicotine suppress appetite? It stimulates pro-opiomelanocortic neurons in the hypothalamus. This sends signals to reduce hunger. Additionally, as we said before, it also increases adrenaline. This boosts your metabolism, making you burn more calories when at rest. But here's the problem. Some people use nicotine to suppress their appetite in order to eat less food and lose weight. But this is not a sustainable method, and it reinforces addiction. Also, this will lit a fire perhaps. I'm gonna make a future video specifically about that, but calories is not the cause of obesity. It is a byproduct of obesity. The last part in understanding how nicotine works in the human body is understanding vasoconstriction and blood flow. Nicotine's effects aren't limited to the brain. It also has an effect on the circulatory system. Nicotine works as a vasoconstrictor. This means it narrows blood vessels and it reduces blood flow. But what happens when we have less blood going to a tissue? Blood carries oxygen with hemoglobin. So if we don't have enough oxygen, that's also a problem. It increases the risk of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and even erectile dysfunction. So on the more unscientific side, if you want to please your partner in bed, then perhaps you should consider staying away from nicotine for a little while. Now let's move to the second part of the video, analyzing the differences between the delivery systems of nicotine. The delivery system of nicotine is simply the method with which you get the nicotine into your body. And as you probably finally awaited, we will talk about the very popular snus. How you get nicotine into your body is just as important as nicotine itself. The most historically used, cigarettes. Cigarettes, I believe, having looked at the literature, is the most dangerous way of getting nicotine into your body. Burning tobacco releases over 7,000 chemicals, including tar, benzene, and carbon monoxide, the thing cars emit from the back. This rapid nicotine delivery contributes to high addiction potential and widespread organ damage. Number 2. Vaping. I'm holding Snus for the end. Vaping was marketed as a much healthier version of cigarettes at first, and many people fell for that, including scientists and doctors. But at the end of the day, you are inhaling chemicals produced for 10 cents in China. What do you think you're gonna get? Many vaping e-liquids contain very harmful substances you definitely don't want in your body. It's not just nicotine, and even the vapes which don't have nicotine, they need to have other chemicals which stimulate a similar effect, potentially even more toxic than nicotine. They contain harmful byproducts like formaldehyde and diacetyl. These have been linked to a condition you might have seen on TikTok called popcorn lung. Additionally, some vapes deliver even higher nicotine doses than cigarettes themselves. The moment most of the people who clicked on this video were waiting for: Snus. Snus is undoubtedly a huge trend in the recent years. What I find fascinating is that most times when people use snus, they use it in much higher doses than they would use cigarettes or other methods. Snus has a very interesting thing going on. It bypasses the lungs, which means you do not inhale the smoke. But it also increases the risk of oral cancer. It's often marketed as a harm reduction tool, and potentially it could be. But if you use snus in so high doses, you need to accept that it can potentially also give you oral cancer because you have all the substances, mostly nicotine, in your mouth all the time. I believe it is a healthier version, but it still contributes to oral cancer, and you still get much higher doses of nicotine than the doses that in experimentation could show potential health benefits. And then we have natural sources. You have to understand that nicotine is a plant. It's not a very difficult chemical synthesized compound in some lab somewhere. Apart from the nicotine plant itself, we also find nicotine in other plants like tomatoes and other nightshades, which you wouldn't expect, but in very small amounts. But also in our biology, we have genetically nicotinic receptors in our body, which raises an argument that potentially we were created to interact with nicotine. And finally, answering to the title of this video, let's see the bigger picture. Is nicotine ever healthy to consume? Nicotine has been shown in studies to raise some health benefits. You might have heard that during COVID, nicotine could reduce your chances of contracting it or making it a severe illness for you. And there is some truth to that scientifically. But apart from that, most research which has been done for nicotine has been done in mice. Now, I'm not one of these people who say that just because the study was done in lab experimentation, we cannot translate any of the results to humans. No, some mechanisms are very similar, and we can, I believe, transfer some theoretical findings to potential use in humans, which is why we always experiment in animals before we experiment in humans. Before I reveal what the science says, I want to make something very, very clear. I'm not a doctor yet. I'm a medical student and passionate researcher, I would say. I love spending time studying studies, and I like interpreting them, and I like sharing what I learn with the entire world. This channel is about a scientific exploration of human nature, medicine, and potentially some wellness topics, but it is not medical advice. Even if the only thing accomplished with this video is to make you think or even do your own research, which you are allowed to do no matter what anyone tells you, but you should also learn how to interpret results and not trust blindly things you read. If I manage to do that, then I would consider that a successful video, even if I get 100 views. But let's go back to the point. Nicotine's use goes far beyond addiction. We talked about the bad health effects of nicotine. We also talked about how it rewires your brain using dopamine to do that. Needless to say what it does to your organs, you've probably seen similar images to these. But let's ask the forbidden, controversial question. Is nicotine ever healthy to consume? It all depends on the context we apply to the conversation. Nicotine has some very special, interesting effects in human physiology, which has spiked recently the curiosity of researchers to see that compound in a different way and not stigmatize it as a chemical molecule, nicotine, but in the broader context of smoking is bad, which is, of course, true. The fact that nicotine can interact with nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in your brain and enhance cognitive performance, focus, memory, learning, etc. has been shown in studies. In fact, there's ongoing research at the moment for nicotine as a potential treatment for neurodegenerative disorders, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and more. Many neurodegenerative disorders depend on things like dopamine, epinephrine, acetylcholine, which are all biological mechanisms often impaired in these diseases. But before you start thinking of nicotine as a wonder drug, this research is preliminary, largely conducted in animal models with very controlled nicotine doses. Not the same kind you would get from smoking a cigarette or a vape. If you smoke cigarettes to get health benefits from the nicotine, it's like eating ketchup to get your daily recommendation of vegetables because ketchup is made from tomatoes. Is nicotine really the villain we make it out to be? From a purely scientific perspective, the answer is nuanced. Nicotine itself is not inherently evil. It's simply a chemical compound which exists in nature, in the nicotine plant, in other plants like nightshades, even in tomatoes. In very controlled cases, scenarios, and experiments, it could have some benefits in neurodegenerative disorders, or simple tasks like focus and mental cognition. Nicotine is still an addictive compound. Dopamine, remember? And it has long-term effects on brain plasticity, cardiovascular system. It makes it being very far away from a healthy choice. The risks outweigh the benefits, especially when it's being used recreationally. Nicotine is a prime example of how science most times is not black or white. It needs exploration, curiosity, and most of all, data. For those already using nicotine, harm reduction strategies like transitioning to a delivery system with less health risks could be a start. If this video gave you a new perspective, let me know in the comments. What do you think about nicotine? Do you use nicotine? And how many people that you know use nicotine? Did anything surprise you? And are there any other health topics you would like me to dive into? Let me know in the comments and I'd love to explore them. Stay informed, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.